Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The journey begins on worn-out tires and borrowed hope. It's the night of September 26, 2014, in the city of Iguala, in the Mexican state of Guerrero. The air is thick and warm, smelling of diesel fumes and damp earth. Inside two commandeered buses, students are packed together, their voices a mixture of nervous energy and youthful defiance. They are not ordinary university students. They are normalistas, aspiring teachers from the Raúl Isidro Burgos Rural Teachers College in a nearby town called Ayotzinapa. Their school is a living monument, a bastion of leftist ideology born from the fiery ideals of the Mexican Revolution. It is one of a handful of surviving escuelas, normales rurales, rural teachers' colleges, established in the 1920s with a profound mission: to bring literacy and a political conscience to the nation's poorest and most marginalized indigenous communities. These young men, most in their late teens or early 20s, are the sons of farmers and laborers. For them, Ayotzinapa is more than an education. It is a lifeline. It is their only path out of the crushing poverty that has defined their families for generations. The curriculum is Spartan and rigorous, a blend of pedagogy, agriculture, and radical political theory. They learn to teach children how to read and write, but they also learn about Marx, about social justice, and about the long history of state repression in Mexico. Their school lacks basic resources, books, computers, sometimes even adequate food. So, they learn to fight for what they need, to organize, to protest. Commandeering buses to attend demonstrations is a time-honored, if legally gray, ritual. It is a tactic born of necessity, a way to make their voices heard in a country that would prefer they remain silent. Their destination tonight is Mexico City, a long overnight drive away. They plan to join the annual commemoration of the 1968 Tlatelolco massacre, a dark day in the nation's history when the government opened fire on student protesters, killing hundreds. They seek to honor the ghosts of a past generation of activists while asserting their own voice in the present. They believe in the power of protest, in the necessity of demanding more from a government that so often gives them so little. They are filled with the kind of fearless idealism that belongs only to the young. They do not know that they are driving directly into a meticulously planned ambush, an operation where the lines between law enforcement, government, and organized crime have not just blurred, but have completely dissolved. Within hours, their journey of protest will become a desperate flight for survival. Gunfire will shatter the night, staining the streets of Iguala with blood. Some students will be killed where they stand. 6 people in total will die that night. And 43 of the young men from Ayotzinapa will be rounded up, forced into police vehicles, and driven away into the darkness. They will vanish, swallowed whole by the night, by a conspiracy so vast and so deeply embedded in the structures of power that it would take years of painstaking work by international investigators to even begin to untangle it. The Mexican government would quickly offer a simple, horrifying story: a case of mistaken identity, a local corrupt mayor, a drug cartel, a remote garbage dump, and a fire hot enough to turn 43 human bodies into ash and bone fragments. They would call it the historical truth, but it was a lie, a carefully constructed narrative designed to cauterize a wound that exposed the nation's rotten core. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect not the mind of a lone killer, but the far more complex and terrifying machinery of a captured state. We explore the anatomy of state-level corruption and how it orchestrated one of the most haunting mass disappearances in modern history, the 43 of Ayotzinapa. To understand the events of September 26th, we must first understand the ground on which they occurred. The state of Guerrero is one of Mexico's poorest and most violent. It is a rugged, mountainous region, a landscape that is both breathtakingly beautiful and brutally unforgiving. For decades, it has been a major hub for opium poppy cultivation and heroin production, a lucrative enterprise that has fueled the rise of vicious drug cartels. In 2014, the dominant force in Iguala and its surrounding areas was a cartel known as the Guerreros Unidos, or United Warriors. They were not just a criminal gang. They were a shadow government. They had splintered from the larger, more infamous Beltranliva organization and had carved out their own fiefdom through extreme violence. They controlled territory, extorted businesses, and enforced their own brutal form of justice with absolute impunity. The official government in Iguala was led by Mayor José Luis Abarca and his wife, Maria de Los Angeles Pineda Villa. They were the public face of a deeply rotted power structure. Their rise was a case study in the narco-politics that had come to define so many parts of Mexico. Pineda Villa's family background was no secret. She was the daughter and sister of notorious drug traffickers. Two of her brothers had been high-ranking operators for the Beltranliva cartel before their deaths. Her family, the Pineda Villa clan, was synonymous with organized crime in the region. Abarca, a former jewelry merchant who became a wealthy businessman and then a politician, was widely understood to have built his career on the foundation of his wife's criminal connections. He was the political arm of the operation, providing the institutional protection that allowed the Guerreros Unidos to flourish. In Iguala, the municipal police didn't work against the cartel. They worked for them. Officers were on the cartel's payroll, acting as lookouts, enforcers, and foot soldiers. This unholy alliance of political power and criminal enterprise was the bedrock of authority in the city. This fusion of crime and state was not just transactional. It was personal and violent. A year before the students disappeared, in May 2013, a local community organizer named Arturo Hernandez Cardona, a vocal critic of Abarca, was kidnapped along with 7 others. 3 of the victims were later found dead, showing signs of horrific torture. One of the survivors would later testify that he witnessed Mayor Abarca himself shoot and kill Hernandez Cardona, telling him, "I'm going to give myself the pleasure of killing you." Though the accusation was public, Abarca's political immunity and control over the local justice system ensured he was never charged. This was the man in charge of Iguala, a mayor who was not just complicit with criminals, but was allegedly a murderer himself. Into this toxic ecosystem drove the normalistas from Ayotzinapa. The school and its students were a perpetual source of irritation for the Guerrero state government. They were organized, vocal, and a constant reminder of the state's failures to provide for its poorest citizens. Their practice of commandeering buses was a well-known, if contentious, tradition. On the evening of September 26th, the students arrived in Iguala around 5:30 p.m. Their plan was to take several buses from the city's central terminal for their protest trip. They were unaware of a crucial fact. That very evening, Maria de Los Angeles Pineda Villa, the mayor's wife, was hosting a lavish public event. It was the presentation of her annual report as head of the local family services agency, but it was understood by everyone to be the unofficial launch of her campaign to succeed her husband as mayor. For the Abarcapaneda political machine, this was a critical night. The presence of dozens of disruptive, politically radical students was perceived not as a minor nuisance, but as a direct threat, an unacceptable challenge to their absolute authority. According to government phone intercepts that would later be revealed, the order came directly from the top. Abarca, referred to as A5 in police communications, gave the command to confront the students. The machinery of the captured state was set in motion. The night descended into a carefully coordinated hunt. The first wave of violence erupted around 9:30 p.m. near the city center, as two buses carrying the students, an Estrella de Oro 1568 and a Costa Line 2513, moved down Juan N. Alvarez Street. They were ambushed by Iguala municipal police patrol cars. The officers didn't attempt to negotiate or make arrests. They immediately opened fire. The sound of high-caliber weapons tore through the night air. Bullets shredded the tires and shattered the windows, sending shards of glass flying through the buses. The students, unarmed and terrified, dove to the floor and scrambled for cover. It was utter chaos. Some managed to kick out emergency windows and flee on foot, scattering into the dark streets. One of them, a 22-year-old named Aldo Gutierrez Solano, was struck in the head by a police bullet. He fell to the pavement, critically wounded, and would be left in a permanent vegetative state. Another student, 23-year-old Daniel Solis Gallardo, was shot dead at the scene, his body left on the asphalt. The survivors from this initial assault, shocked and bloodied, regrouped. They spoke to local reporters who had arrived, their voices trembling with a mixture of fear and outrage. Standing in front of their bullet-riddled bus, they held an impromptu press conference, desperately trying to broadcast what was happening. They believed the presence of cameras would offer them some measure of protection. They were tragically mistaken. Around midnight, a second, more brutal wave of attacks began. This time, the assailants were a mix of municipal police and heavily armed men in civilian clothes. The sicarios of the Guerreros Unidos. It was a joint operation. They descended on the location where the students were gathered with overwhelming and indiscriminate force. In a terrifying display of this indiscriminate violence, the attackers also targeted a completely unrelated bus on the same highway. This bus was carrying a 3rd Division soccer team, Los Avispones de Chilpancingo, the Chilpancingo Wasps. The players, mostly teenagers, were returning home exhausted and celebrating a victory. The gunmen, apparently mistaking them for more students, riddled their bus with bullets. The driver, Victor Manuel Lugo Ortiz, was killed instantly. A 15-year-old player, David Josue Garcia Evangelista, was also killed. On the same stretch of road, a woman named Blanca Montiel, traveling in a taxi with her husband, was struck and killed by a stray bullet. The message was clear and horrific. No one was safe. The city of Iguala had become a free-fire zone. The main targets, however, remained the Ayotzinapa students. During this second onslaught, 2 more students were killed in the street, Julio Cesar Ramirez Nava and Julio Cesar Mondragon Fontes. Mondragon, a passionate student from Mexico City, tried to escape on foot. He was captured. The next morning his body would be discovered on an industrial road a short distance away. He had been subjected to unimaginable torture. His eyes had been gouged out, and his face had been flayed. The skin and muscle peeled away from the skull. It was a signature of cartel terror, an act of calculated barbarism designed to send a message of unspeakable cruelty. Amidst the gunfire and screaming, the central event of the night unfolded with chilling efficiency. Police officers from both Iguala and the neighboring town of Hutsuko, working in concert, systematically rounded up the surviving students. They were beaten with batons, kicked, and thrown into the back of patrol trucks like sacks of grain. One student, hiding under a nearby vehicle, managed to take a blurry but crucial photo with his phone, showing his classmates being forced into the back of Iguala police truck number 302. It would become one of the last images ever taken of them. By the end of the night, 43 of the young men from Ayotzinapa were gone. They had been taken by the state and handed over to its criminal partners, vanishing into the abyss of its corruption. The morning of September 27th broke over a city in shock. The streets were littered with shattered glass, abandoned shoes, and dark, drying pools of blood, but the most terrifying thing was the silence. 43 young men were missing. Their families, hearing the fragmented and horrifying news reports, began a frantic search. They descended on Iguala, going to police stations, to hospitals, to the local military base, their hearts filled with a dread that was quickly turning to despair. They begged for information, for any sign of their sons. They were met with a wall of denials, bureaucratic indifference, and veiled threats. The mayor, José Luis Abarca, and his police chief Felipe Flores Velázquez claimed to know nothing. A few days later, as the national scandal began to explode, they both vanished, becoming fugitives from the law they once commanded. The case was too big, too explosive to be contained locally. It quickly became a national and international human rights crisis. The Mexican federal government, under then-President Enrique Peña Nieto, was forced to intervene. The investigation was taken over by the Federal Attorney General's Office, the PGR, led by a man named Jesus Murillo Karam. The pressure to solve the case was immense. The world was watching. The government needed an answer, and it needed one fast. Over the next few weeks, investigators began making arrests, pulling in low-level members of the Guerreros Unidos cartel and dozens of Iguala and Hutsuco municipal police officers. And under intense interrogation, a story began to emerge, a neat, linear, and utterly horrifying narrative. According to the confessions extracted from these detainees, the Iguala police had indeed acted on the orders of Mayor Abarca. They had intercepted the students and handed them over to the Guerreros Unidos. The cartel's leader, Cedronio Casarubias Salgado, allegedly believed the students were members of a rival gang, Los Rojos, attempting to infiltrate his territory. The confessions described how the 43 students were packed into trucks and driven to a municipal garbage dump in the nearby town of Cocula. There, at the bottom of a ravine, many of them were already suffocated from being piled on top of each other. The survivors were interrogated and then executed. To dispose of the bodies and eliminate all evidence, the cartel members built a massive pyre using tires, firewood, and diesel fuel. They burned the bodies for more than 15 hours, at temperatures so high that the remains were almost completely obliterated, reduced to ash and tiny charred bone fragments. The assassins then allegedly gathered these ashes into black trash bags, drove to the nearby San Juan River, and emptied them into the water. On November 7, 2014, just over a month after the disappearance, Attorney General Murillo Karam held a dramatic, televised press conference. He laid out this entire narrative in meticulous detail. He presented it as the definitive, irrefutable conclusion of the investigation. He presented the confessions of the detainees. He presented forensic reports on bone fragments that Navy divers had supposedly recovered from a trash bag found in the San Juan River. And he made a crucial announcement. Experts at a highly specialized laboratory at the University of Innsbruck in Austria had managed to identify one of these fragments. Through advanced mitochondrial DNA analysis, it had been matched to one of the missing students, a 19-year-old named Alexander Mora-Venancio. With this single piece of forensic evidence, the government believed it had validated its entire story. Mario Caram, with an air of exhausted finality, declared, "Esta es la verdad histórica." This is the historical truth. He concluded the press conference with a now infamous phrase, sighing, "Ya me cansé." I've had enough. For the government, the case was essentially closed. It was a tragic, localized event, a story of a corrupt mayor colluding with a brutal cartel. It was a contained horror, an aberration, not a symptom of a systemic disease. The parents of the 43, however, refused to believe it. Their grief was matched only by their skepticism. How could a fire in an open-air garbage dump on a night when it had rained burn hot enough to incinerate 43 bodies to the point of near-total annihilation? Why were there so many inconsistencies in the suspects' testimonies? They felt the historical truth was a fabrication, a monstrous lie designed to silence their questions and bury their sons a second time. The family's powerful refusal to accept the government's narrative, combined with immense international pressure from the United Nations and other human rights organizations, led to an unprecedented development. The Mexican government agreed to allow a team of independent international experts to review the case. They were called the GIEI, the Spanish acronym for the Interdisciplinary Group of Independent Experts, appointed by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. The team was composed of 5 distinguished professionals: a former Attorney General from Guatemala, human rights lawyers from Chile and Colombia, a Spanish psychologist, and a physician. Their mandate was to scrutinize the official investigation, re-examine the evidence, and provide an independent assessment. What they uncovered would not just challenge the historical truth, it would demolish it, piece by agonizing piece, exposing the anatomy of a massive government cover-up. The GIEI began its work in 2015, diving into the sprawling case file, which contained thousands upon thousands of pages of documents, witness testimonies, and forensic reports. Almost immediately, they began to find gaping holes and disturbing irregularities. Their first major focus was the absolute centerpiece of the government's story, the massive body-consuming fire at the Cocula garbage dump. The GIEI brought in one of the world's foremost experts in fire science, Dr. José Terrero, to conduct an independent analysis of the site and the government's claims. Dr. Terrero's findings, presented in the GIEI's first report, were an explosive refutation of the official narrative. He concluded that it was scientifically impossible for a fire of the magnitude required to incinerate 43 human bodies to have occurred at the Cocula dump. To reduce that much human mass to ash would require a sustained temperature of over 1,600 degrees Celsius for approximately 60 hours. This would have necessitated an enormous amount of fuel, at least 30 tons of wood, the equivalent of a large timber lorry, plus over 13 tons of tires. The detainees' confessions spoke of a much smaller fire. Such a colossal blaze would have produced a plume of smoke hundreds of feet high, visible for miles, yet not a single resident in the surrounding area reported seeing one. Furthermore, the intense, prolonged heat would have scorched the earth and incinerated all surrounding vegetation, yet Dr. Terrero's team found the trees and plants just meters from the alleged pyre were largely unharmed. The ground itself showed no evidence of exposure to such extreme temperatures. Dr. Terrero's conclusion was blunt and unequivocal. The historical truth was a scientific fantasy. The mass incineration at the Kokula dump simply did not happen. This finding was a bombshell. If the students weren't burned at the dump, then the entire official story collapsed. It meant the government's narrative was not just flawed, it was a deliberate fiction. The GIEI then turned its attention to the confessions upon which this fiction was built. They interviewed the detained suspects and reviewed their medical reports. A sickening pattern emerged. Overwhelming, systematic evidence of torture. Detainees described being asphyxiated with plastic bags, subjected to electric shocks to their genitals, waterboarded, and severely beaten to force them to sign pre-written confessions that perfectly supported the garbage dump story. Dozens of official medical examinations documented injuries consistent with these claims. Bruises, burns, broken bones. Yet these findings were systematically ignored by the Attorney General's office. The historical truth had not been discovered through investigation. It had been constructed through coercion and brutality. The GIEI's investigation then uncovered another critical piece of information that had been deliberately erased from the official account. On the night of the attacks, the students hadn't commandeered just 2 or even 4 buses. They had taken 5. This 5th bus, a passenger bus from the Estrella de Oro line, was completely absent from the government's investigation. It was a ghost in the official narrative. Why was it ignored? The GIEI, through interviews with surviving students and analysis of transportation records, developed a chilling and plausible hypothesis. They suggested that this bus, unlike the others, was not just a random vehicle. Iguala is a major transit hub for heroin trafficked from the poppy fields of Guerrero to the United States, particularly Chicago. The GIEI posited that this 5th bus may have been a trap bus, unwittingly carrying a secret cargo of heroin or cash, part of a trafficking route protected at the highest levels. This theory provided a powerful alternative motive for the ferocity and extreme coordination of the attack. It wasn't just about a mayor's wife's party being disrupted. It was about protecting a multi-million-dollar drug shipment. The students, by randomly commandeering that specific bus, had accidentally stumbled into a massive criminal operation, making them a threat that needed to be eliminated with extreme prejudice. This would explain the scale of the response, which involved not just the Iguala Municipal Police, but also officers from Hutsuco, Federal Police, and, as the GIEI would discover, the direct surveillance and likely complicity of the Mexican military. The GIEI found undeniable proof that the Federal Police and the Army were aware of the students' movements and the attacks in real time. Iguala was home to the 27th Infantry Battalion of the Mexican Army. The military base was located less than 2 miles from where some of the attacks took place. The city's C4 Surveillance Center, a hub of CCTV cameras and emergency communications, was monitored by municipal, state, federal, and military personnel. Side by side, it was inconceivable that they did not know what was happening. In fact, survivors testified that they saw military personnel at the scenes of the attacks. Some students even fled to a local hospital for medical care, only to be intimidated and photographed by soldiers who arrived shortly after. The families had begged the military to search their barracks for the missing students, but their requests were repeatedly denied. The army claimed they were not involved, that they had remained on their base all night, but evidence uncovered by the GIEI, including phone records and inconsistencies in official logs, strongly suggested this was false. The state, at multiple levels, local, federal, and military, was not just failing to act, it was an active participant in the crime and its subsequent cover-up. The head of the Criminal Investigation Agency at the time, Tomas Zarin, was personally implicated by the GIEI in orchestrating this cover-up. The GIEI unearthed a video showing Zarin at the San Juan River with a key suspect who showed clear signs of torture, a full day before the bag of bone fragments belonging to Alexander Mora was officially discovered there by Navy divers. The video shows Zarin threatening the detainee and walking him along the riverbank, effectively staging the discovery of the only piece of physical evidence that linked a student to the government's false narrative. It was a smoking gun, proof of evidence tampering and obstruction of justice at the highest level of the investigation. The GIEI's explosive reports, released in 2015 and 2016, sent shockwaves through Mexico and the world. They systematically dismantled the government's narrative and exposed the anatomy of a state-sponsored crime. They showed how police forces acted as the armed wing of a cartel, how the justice system used torture to manufacture a convenient truth, and how federal and military authorities were, at best, criminally negligent and, at worst, directly complicit. The Peña Nieto government's reaction to the GIEI's findings was predictably hostile. They stonewalled the experts, denied them access to key witnesses, particularly military personnel, and launched a vicious smear campaign against them in the media. Ultimately, the government refused to renew the GIEI's mandate, forcing them to leave the country in 2016. The message was clear. The truth was not welcome. The system was protecting itself. But the damage to the official story was irreparable. The historical truth was dead. The fight for the real story, and for the 43 missing students, was now a fight against the entire corrupt structure of the Mexican state. In the years that followed the GIEI's departure, the Ayotzinapa case entered a painful and frustrating limbo. The parents of the 43, along with their supporters, continued their tireless campaign for justice, marching, protesting, and keeping the memory of their sons alive. Their slogan, "Vivos se los llevaron," "Vivos los queremos," "They were taken alive, we want them back alive," became a rallying cry for all victims of enforced disappearances in Mexico, a number that has now tragically surpassed 100,000 people. The case became a potent symbol of the country's crisis of human rights and impunity, a deep, unhealing wound on the national psyche. The election of a new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, in December 2018, brought a renewed sense of hope. He had campaigned on a promise to end corruption and to solve the Ayotzinapa case, a pledge that resonated deeply with a public weary of deception. One of his first acts as president was to sign a decree creating a special Truth and Justice Commission for Ayotzinapa. This new commission was given broad powers to reinvestigate the crime, free from the constraints and corruption of the previous administration. Slowly, painstakingly, the wheels of justice began to turn again, grinding against the immense resistance of a system built on secrets and lies. The new investigation began to yield results. Arrest warrants were issued for key figures involved in the original cover-up. Tomas Zarin, the former chief investigator who was filmed manipulating the crime scene, fled the country to escape prosecution. He is now a fugitive in Israel, which has so far refused Mexico's requests for his extradition. And in a stunning turn of events, in August 2022, the former Attorney General himself, Jesus Murillo Karam, the very architect of the historical truth, was arrested at his home in Mexico City. He was charged with enforced disappearance, torture, and obstruction of justice. The man who had once arrogantly declared the case closed was now a prisoner, accused of masterminding the lie that had defined it for so long. The Truth Commission released its own preliminary report shortly after Murillo Karam's arrest. It was a blunt and damning assessment. It officially declared the disappearance of the 43 students a crime of the state. The report stated unequivocally that there was no evidence to suggest the students were still alive. It confirmed the collusion of municipal, state, and federal authorities, including, for the first time in an official government document, the military. The report detailed how a soldier, Julio Cesar Lopez Patolzin, had infiltrated the Ayotzinapa school as an informant and was providing real-time intelligence to his superiors on the night of the disappearance. This soldier was one of the 43 who were taken. The report suggested that his commanders, knowing one of their own was with the students, did nothing to save him or the others, and actively participated in the cover-up, obstructing justice at every turn. While these developments represent a seismic shift from the initial years of denial, true justice remains elusive. The masterminds of the crime, including former Mayor José Luis Abarca and his wife Maria de Los Angeles Pineda Villa, are in prison, but primarily on other charges like money laundering and connections to organized crime, not directly for the disappearance of the 43. Dozens of lower-level police and cartel members who were arrested have been released from prison due to procedural errors and overwhelming evidence that their confessions were obtained through torture. A bitter irony, as the very tool the state used to build its lie is now what allows many of the guilty to walk free. A profound pact of silence, particularly within the military, continues to shield many of the perpetrators from accountability. And most painfully of all, the whereabouts of the students remain a mystery. Over the years, extensive searches have been conducted across the state of Guerrero. Clandestine graves have been unearthed, revealing the horrifying scale of violence in the region, but they have not held the bodies of the missing 43. To date, the remains of only 3 of the students have been found and positively identified. The first was Alexander Mora Venancio, from the fragment found in the river. In 2020, a tiny bone fragment belonging to Christian Alfonso Rodriguez Tellember was found in a different location, a ravine miles from the Cocula dump. A year later, another fragment identified Josevani Guerrero de la Cruz. For the families of the other 40, there is no grave to visit, no body to mourn, only a crushing, unending absence. The case of the 43 Ayotzinapa students is far more than a simple true crime story. It is a portrait of a nation held hostage by corruption. It exposes an anatomy where the institutions designed to protect citizens become their predators. The crime was not an anomaly. It was the logical outcome of a system where political power is bought with cartel money, where police badges are rented out to the highest bidder, and where justice is a commodity reserved for the powerful. The initial attack in Iguala was a violent expression of this rotten system. Local authorities acting as enforcers for a criminal enterprise, eliminating a perceived threat to their shared interests. But it is the cover-up, the meticulous and cynical creation of the historical truth that provides the most chilling lesson. It reveals a deeper, more insidious level of corruption. This was not just a few bad cops in a rural town. This was a coordinated effort that reached the highest levels of the federal government. It involved investigators, prosecutors, and forensic teams who were willing to torture suspects, plant evidence, and fabricate a scientific impossibility to protect the state itself. They were not trying to solve a crime. They were trying to manage a political crisis. The goal was not to find the students, but to make the story go away. They needed to bury the truth so deeply that it could never threaten the stability of a system that was implicated at every level, from the local patrol car to the federal police and the National Army. The historical truth was a narrative firewall, designed to contain the damage and prevent the flames from reaching the true architects of the crime. It was a story that sacrificed 43 young men and their families to preserve the fiction of a functional state. The anatomy of this crime, therefore, is the anatomy of impunity. The tireless work of the families and the independent experts from the GIEI was a courageous act of defiance against this machine. They refused to be silenced, refused to accept the unacceptable, and in doing so, they exposed the rot for the entire world to see. The final resting place of the students remains unknown, a haunting question mark hanging over Mexico. Their case has become a permanent scar, a symbol of the thousands of other disappearances that occur with sickening regularity. It serves as a constant, painful reminder of what happens when the very people sworn to uphold the law are the ones who break it most brutally. The story is not over, because for 40 families there is no end in sight. They are trapped in the echo of that terrible night, searching for sons who were erased by the very country they were born to serve. The search for the 43 is not just a search for bodies, but a search for the soul of a nation still grappling with the ghosts of a crime it committed against its own children. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.